At 10:30 a.m. on April 7, 1943, the tropical skies over Guadalcanal, usually a brilliant, unbroken blue, were suddenly marred by a dark, ominous swarm. 22-year-old First Lieutenant James Sweat, squinting through the glare of the sun from the cockpit of his F-4F Wildcat, felt a chill run down his spine as he counted. 150 Japanese aircraft, closing in fast. For the young Marine pilot, this was uncharted and terrifying territory. Just 197 flight hours in the Wildcat. Not a single minute of prior combat experience. The incoming formation was a deadly assembly. 67 Val dive bombers, their stubby wings and bulky fuselages designed for precision strikes, escorted by 110 nimble Zero fighters. It marked the largest Japanese aerial assault since the pivotal Battle of Midway 9 months earlier. A brute force attack that threatened to overwhelm the Allied forces stationed on the island and the fleet anchored nearby. Sweat's unit, Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 221, had arrived on Guadalcanal only 63 days prior. Since February, his duties had been limited to routine patrols. No enemy sightings, no combat action, just endless hours of cruising the skies without incident. On that fateful April 7th, he'd already completed 2 uneventful morning patrols when the scramble order blared at 10:20 a.m. Like most days, he initially brushed it off as another false alarm. Intelligence had noted a surge in Japanese radio traffic, but false alerts were a daily annoyance. The pattern was predictable. Heightened radio chatter, radar picking up ghost contacts, fighters scrambling only to find empty skies. This time, however, there was a critical difference. Leading his division was Captain Joseph Foss, a seasoned ace with 26 confirmed kills to his name. Foss guided 4 Wildcats off Henderson Field, banking into a climbing turn toward the northwest. They had a mere 15 minutes to intercept before the bombers reached the Allied fleet anchored off Tulagi. At 8,000 feet, Sweat's worst fears crystallized into a horrifying reality. The sky ahead was not just filled with enemy aircraft. It was dominated by them, a living, buzzing cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon. He fixed his gaze on the nearest cluster, counting 15 Val bombers, flying in a tight, disciplined formation, their wings almost touching as they roared forward. Behind them, more waves of Vals and Zeros extended into the distance, a relentless tide of steel and fire. Looming 3,000 feet above the bombers, Zero fighters circled like vultures, their sleek, deadly silhouettes glinting in the sun as they provided high cover. The odds hit Sweat like a punch to the gut. 37 Japanese aircraft for every American fighter in the air. 4 Wildcats, 4 pilots, pitted against 150 enemy planes. It was a mismatch of almost suicidal proportions. The Grumman F-4F-4 Wildcat was no match for the Zero in raw performance. It maxed out at 318 miles per hour at 19,000 feet, while the Zero hit 350 miles per hour and outclimbed the Wildcat by 1,500 feet per minute. But the Wildcat was built tough, like a flying tank, able to absorb brutal punishment and keep flying. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns delivered devastating close-range firepower, with 240 rounds per gun, 1,440 total. Enough for 24 seconds of continuous fire if the trigger was held down. Sweat's hands, though slightly clammy, moved with mechanical precision as he ran through his pre-combat checks. Each step drilled into him by endless hours of training. Oil pressure, steady, green light glowing softly. Fuel gauge, reading full, enough for an hour of hard flight, if he survived that long. He flipped the switch for the gun sight power, and the illuminated pipper, his target marker, materialized in the reflector glass, sharp and steady, perfectly centered. With a deep, shuddering breath, he moved the master armament switch to armed. The gun-charging handles had been pulled back earlier, during pre-flight, so 6 chambers were already loaded and ready to fire. He dry-fired these guns 100 times during training, had studied photos of enemy aircraft until he could draw them from memory, but he'd never fired a single round in anger, never seen a live enemy plane outside of a textbook. Now hundreds of them filled his sky, and he was about to face them head-on. Foss positioned the division for a head-on attack on the lead bomber formation. The Vals were already beginning their dives toward the transport ships in Tulagi Harbor. Sweat followed Foss downward through 8,000 feet. At 400 yards, Foss opened fire. His tracers arced toward the lead Val, and the bomber's engine erupted in a ball of orange flame, nosediving sharply into the water below. Sweat's eyes locked onto the second Val in the formation, his mind narrowing to a singular focus: target, range, fire. Closing fast at 350 yards, he steadied his grip on the control stick, centering the glowing pipper dead on the Val's cockpit, where he knew the pilot sat. He squeezed the trigger gently, not jerking, just as he'd been taught. The Wildcat shuddered violently as all 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns roared to life. A deafening rhythmic thunder that shook the entire airframe. Spent brass casings spewed from the wing ports in a glittering stream, spinning downward toward the ocean below. For a split second, he saw the Val's canopy shatter, fragments flying, before the bomber rolled sharply inverted, a trail of black smoke coiling behind it as it plummeted toward the water. His first kill. Adrenaline surged through his veins, sharp and electric, but he didn't let it distract him. In the chaos of the dogfight, he swung his aim to another Val, unleashing a tight 3-second burst. The bomber's left wing snapped cleanly at the root, torn away by the hail of bullets, and it spun out of formation, crashing into the sea. 2 kills in just 40 seconds, faster than he'd ever dreamed possible in training. A zero diving from above forced him to yank hard right, the enemy fighter streaking past less than 10 feet away. Sweat rolled right into a tight climbing turn, only to realize his division had scattered in the melee. He was alone. Below, the remaining Vals pressed their bombing runs on the ships. Sweat pushed the stick forward, diving after them as his airspeed surged past 400 miles per hour, the Wildcat's control surfaces stiffening with the increased airflow. He targeted the nearest Val, fired a short burst, and watched it explode. 3 kills in under 6 minutes. Pulling out of the dive at 2,000 feet, Sweat scanned the sky, his heart pounding, but his hands steady on the stick. His training was kicking in, hundreds of hours in the cockpit preparing him for this exact moment. Above, he spotted another 15 Vals forming up for their bombing run. 3 tight V formations of 5 aircraft each, their attention fixed on the ships below, unaware of his presence. The lead group rolled into a dive toward the destroyer USS Aaron Ward. Sweat climbed to 6,000 feet, positioning himself above and behind the trailing Val in the first group. Diving from directly above with the sun at his back, a pilot's ideal advantage. At 200 yards, he opened fire, a 4-second burst of 296 rounds. The Val's tail section disintegrated under the hail of .50 caliber rounds, sending the bomber into an uncontrolled spin that ended in a crash into the ocean. 4 kills. His ammunition counter showed he'd used roughly 600 rounds, half his total, with 840 left. 14 more seconds of firing time. He swung left toward the second group of Vals, his excess dive speed carrying him through their formation. He locked onto the nearest target, centered the pipper, and fired. The Val exploded midair, a direct hit on its bomb. The blast was massive, scattering aircraft debris across the sky. 5 kills in 9 minutes. The remaining Vals in the group broke formation instantly. Some jettisoned their bombs to gain speed and fled north toward Rabaul. Others pressed their attacks despite his presence. Sweat stayed on them, scoring his 6th kill 30 seconds later. A Val attempting to escape low toward the Florida Islands. Diving after it, he fired from 150 yards, the optimal range, from directly behind, his tracers searing up the fuselage into the fuel tank. The bomber erupted in orange flame, cartwheeling into the water. His ammunition was running low, maybe 400 rounds left, 6 or 7 seconds of firing time at most. Sweat pulled up, scanning for more targets, his wingmen still nowhere to be seen. The radio was a cacophony of overlapping transmissions from pilots calling out positions and threats. Below, Allied ships unleashed a deadly umbrella of anti-aircraft fire, 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused rounds, 40mm Bofors quad mounts tracking bombers, 20mm Oerlikons adding streams of tracers. Black flak bursts filled the air around him. Then he spotted another Val, its wings tilted as it began a steep dive toward the cargo ships anchored near Gavutu Island. its bomb bay doors likely already open. Sweat didn't hesitate. He rolled the Wildcat inverted, pulling hard through into a split S maneuver, a desperate high G turn that sent blood rushing to his head. The negative G-force was brutal, squeezing his body, making his vision gray at the edges, as if he was staring through a foggy lens. His helmet pressed tightly against the canopy, and he could feel the strain in his neck muscles as he fought to keep his eyes on the target. He tracked the Val through his gun sight as both aircraft plummeted toward Tulagi Harbor, the altimeter unwinding rapidly, its needle spinning like a top. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. Below, the ocean and the ships grew larger by the second. The Val's rear gunner spotted him, and muzzle flashes erupted from the back of the bomber, tracers streaking past his canopy like red-hot needles, narrowly missing his wings. At 1,000 feet, Sweat fired a 2-second burst, about 130 rounds. The Val's engine caught fire immediately, black smoke pouring from the cowling. It crashed into the harbor near Gavutu Island, sending up a massive splash. 7 kills in 12 minutes. He pulled out of the dive at 300 feet above the water, his altimeter barely registering above zero. He was now inside the ship's defensive fire zone, the most dangerous airspace in the battle area, where gunners couldn't distinguish American fighters from Japanese bombers at this altitude and speed. He was just another target. Above, one more Val began its attack dive, a tempting 8th target that taunted him. He had roughly 250 rounds left, 3 or 4 seconds of fire at most, and he climbed after it, his damaged Wildcat straining to gain altitude. But something felt wrong, a subtle but unmistakable sluggishness in the controls, as if the plane was fighting against him. He glanced at his instruments, all still showing normal readings, but then a violent, jarring impact jolted the left wing, sending the Wildcat lurching hard to the left. Sweat fought the controls with both hands, his muscles screaming as he applied full right aileron and rudder, trying to bring the plane back on course. He risked a quick glance out the left side of the canopy, and his stomach dropped. A massive, jagged hole gaped in the wing, easily 2 feet across, metal skin peeled back around the edges like torn paper. It was friendly fire, a 40-millimeter Bofors shell from one of the Allied ships he'd been fighting to protect, had punched straight through his wing. The very ships he was defending had turned on him. Fuel streamed from the ruptured tank, leaving a white vapor trail. The Wildcat still flew, but barely. The damaged wing created massive drag, his airspeed bleeding off rapidly, unable to maintain altitude. The Val he'd been chasing pulled away. Sweat fired a desperate long burst, emptying most of his remaining ammunition, but his tracers fell 50 yards short. The Val escaped into the northern clouds. His guns clicked empty, all 1,440 rounds spent in less than 15 minutes. Warning lights flashed on his instrument panel, oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature spiking into the red. He looked at the engine cowling, paint blistering. The enemy rear gunner must have hit him during the last attack. His oil cooler was damaged. Thick black smoke, from burning oil not vaporizing coolant, poured from the engine compartment. The temperature gauge climbed past maximum, 210 degrees Celsius, 220 degrees Celsius, 230 degrees Celsius. At 240 degrees Celsius, the engine seized. The propeller stopped instantly, the sudden silence deafening after 15 minutes of combat noise. No engine roar, no wind howl, just the whistle of air over the damaged wing. Sweat was 3 miles from Henderson Field with a dead engine, a damaged wing, and fuel streaming from his tank. The Wildcat began losing altitude rapidly, 500 feet per minute, then 700. The asymmetric drag from the damaged wing made it too heavy to glide effectively. He had 2 options: try to reach Henderson Field 3 miles away, or ditch in the water. At his current descent rate, he'd cover only a mile before hitting the ocean. Henderson Field was impossible. He scanned the water for a safe landing spot. Tulagi Harbor was cluttered with ships and battle debris, too dangerous. He spotted a clear, relatively calm area north of Gavutu Island, away from ship traffic, and turned toward it, using his remaining altitude to position for the water landing. As the Wildcat descended through 1,000 feet, 800, 600, Sweat ran through the ditching checklist from memory. Canopy open, already done. Seat and shoulder harness tight, checked. He transmitted his position one final time. No response. The radio likely damaged. He loosened his oxygen mask but kept it attached. At 400 feet, he realized a critical mistake. He'd forgotten to jettison the canopy. An open canopy would catch water during the ditching, flipping the aircraft inverted. He reached up, released the locks, and the plexiglass canopy tore away in the slipstream. At 200 feet, he braced for impact, holding the nose slightly high to keep the tail down, just as he'd been trained. The tail struck first, the impact enormous despite his preparation. Deceleration threw him forward against his harness, his face slamming into the instrument panel. His nose broke instantly, blood pouring down his face and filling his oxygen mask. The Wildcat bounced once on the water, a harsh, bone-jarring impact that sent a spray of seawater over the canopy before settling into the waves. Water rushed into the cockpit immediately, cold and salty, soaking his flight suit in an instant as the aircraft began to sink fast. Sweat fumbled with his shoulder harness, releasing the clips with shaking hands and tried to stand, but he couldn't move. Something was holding him down, trapping him. He looked down and saw it. His parachute shroud lines had deployed somehow during the ditching, tangling around his legs and wrapping tightly around the control stick, a deadly web that kept him pinned to the sinking plane. The water rose past his knees, then his waist, then his chest, the cold seeping into his bones, making his teeth chatter. He pulled desperately at the lines, yanking with all his strength, but they only tightened, cutting into his skin. The Wildcat's nose tilted forward as water filled the engine compartment, dragging the front of the plane down faster. The water reached his neck, and he took one final gasping breath as it covered his head, plunging him into darkness. Underwater, everything was dark and chaotic, the world reduced to silence and cold. The parachute canopy had partially deployed, wrapping around him like a heavy, suffocating shroud, blocking out what little light filtered down from the surface. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, and his lungs began to burn with a searing pain, a desperate demand for air. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it back, training kicking in even in this life-or-death moment. He fumbled blindly at his belt, searching for the standard issue survival knife he'd been issued, the one he'd checked 100 times before flights. His fingers brushed against the handle, and he grabbed it tightly, pulling it free from its sheath. He began cutting at the thick nylon shroud lines, one by one, the knife's sharp blades slicing through the material with effort. Cutting underwater was clumsy and slow, his movements hampered by the water and the growing agony in his lungs. 1 line, 2 lines, 3. His vision began to blur, the edges going dark as hypoxia set in. 4 lines, 5. He was running out of time, his body screaming for air. 6 lines, 7. Suddenly, the lines went slack. He was free. He kicked hard toward the surface, his deflated Mae West life vest dragging him down like a weight. He hadn't had time to inflate it before the plane sank. His flight boots were full of water, heavy and cumbersome, and his flight suit clung to his body like lead. He kicked again, every muscle in his legs burning, until finally his head broke the surface. He gasped for air, a ragged, desperate breath that filled his mouth with blood and seawater, and he coughed violently, doubling over as he tread water, his broken nose throbbing with every movement. Breathing was nearly impossible through his nose, so he panted through his mouth, trying to catch his breath as waves lapped at his face. He pulled the CO2 inflation toggles on his Mae West. Nothing. He pulled again. Still nothing. The inflation mechanism was damaged or corroded. He reached for his one-man life raft, attached to his parachute harness, and pulled the inflation lanyard. No response. The raft was useless. Alone in the water with no flotation, his arms already tiring, he spotted WWII Island half a mile away, his only hope. He began swimming with a modified side stroke to conserve energy, stopping every third stroke to tread water and catch his breath. After 5 minutes, he'd covered only 100 yards. He struggled out of his heavy leather jacket, it sank instantly, and stripped his flight suit down to his waist, gaining a small reprieve. Another 100 yards, then he collapsed, floating weakly, held up only by air trapped in his remaining clothing. Blood from his broken nose streamed into the water, a thin red trail that spread out around him. Unwanted and dangerous, attracting attention he couldn't afford. Then he saw it, a dark shape rising from the depths below, moving up through the blue water with silent, deadly grace. It was a shark, roughly 8 feet long, its dorsal fin cutting through the surface for a split second before it submerged again. A reef shark, probably, but in his exhausted state, it might as well have been a great white. It circled once at 15 feet depth, its eyes glinting in the dim light, before descending back into the darkness. Sweat forced himself to remain calm, his mind racing. Panic would make him thrash, drawing more sharks, so he kept his movements slow and steady, his breathing as even as he could manage. He resumed swimming toward WWII Island, using long, smooth strokes that conserved energy. No splashing, no sudden movements. 2 minutes later, the shark returned, joined by 2 others, their dark forms circling beneath him, their movements lazy and curious for now. But he knew that could change in an instant. When he was 200 yards from WWII, exhaustion overwhelmed him completely. His arms wouldn't respond anymore, his legs had turned to jelly, and he could no longer kick. He was simply floating, held barely above water by the small amount of air, trapped in the remains of his flight suit. The sharks circled closer now, 10 feet below instead of 15, their presence a constant, terrifying reminder of his vulnerability. He tried to kick them away, but he had no strength left, his body spent. His vision began to narrow again, the edges going dark, and he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness. He was going to drown within sight of land, or the sharks would finish him off. Either way, it seemed his extraordinary day was going to end in a watery grave. Then through the fog of his exhaustion, he heard it, the rumble of a boat engine, growing louder. He tried to turn his head toward the sound, but his neck muscles had given up, too weak to move. A voice shouted something, distinctly American, cutting through the noise of the waves. He tried to respond, to call out, but all he could manage was a weak, ragged cough. Suddenly, strong hands grabbed him under the arms, hauling him upward, lifting him out of the water and away from the circling sharks. It was a Coast Guard rescue boat, crewed by men who'd been watching for downed pilots amid the chaos of the battle. They dragged him over the gunwale, laying him flat on the deck, and he lay there gasping like a landed fish, blood and seawater pouring from his nose and mouth, his body trembling with cold and relief. A Coast Guardsman quickly assessed him. Broken nose, multiple contusions, possible concussion, severe exhaustion, near drowning, but alive. Sweat refused morphine, wanting to stay alert. The boat reached Tulagi 8 minutes later, where a Navy corpsman waited with a stretcher. Sweat refused it, standing unsteadily as the corpsman led him to a medical tent. Inside, the corpsman cleaned his face, packed his nostrils with gauze, and wrapped his head in bandages. He looked like a mummy, the tent filled with wounded sailors from the bombed ships. Sweat walked outside, hitching a ride back to Henderson Field in a jeep driven by a Marine supply sergeant who'd watched the battle from the ground. The sergeant asked if he'd seen the pilot who shot down so many Vals. Sweat said nothing. They arrived at Henderson Field at 11:45 a.m., 75 minutes after takeoff, but it felt like 75 hours. Captain Foss was waiting on the flight line, his Wildcat parked with empty guns, engine still cooling. Foss saw Sweat's bandaged head, asking if he was okay. Sweat nodded. When Foss asked how many Vals he'd shot down, Sweat replied, 7, maybe 8. I'm not sure about the last one. Foss stared, then called over Squadron Intelligence Officer, First Lieutenant Morrison, who carried a clipboard and detailed map of Tulagi Harbor. Morrison debriefed Sweat for 30 minutes, documenting exact times, locations, aircraft types, attack angles, and observed results. His map markings matched witness reports from ships and other pilots. 7 confirmed kills, all in 15 minutes, all on his first combat mission. Morrison stopped writing, staring at Sweat. First mission? He asked. First combat mission, Sweat confirmed. Morrison shook his head. He'd debriefed hundreds of missions, never hearing of anyone becoming an ace. 5 or more kills on their first mission, let alone 7 in 15 minutes. The news spread through Henderson Field within an hour. 7 kills, first mission, shot down by friendly fire, ditched in shark-infested water, nearly drowned, rescued at the last minute. Pilots flocked to see him, some congratulating, others verifying the story. By evening, every pilot on Guadalcanal knew James Sweat's name. Within a week, every naval aviator in the Pacific would know it too. 3 days later, Admiral William Halsey, commander of all Allied forces in the South Pacific, heard the report. He'd seen thousands of combat reports, pilot claims often inflated by adrenaline and confusion. But Sweat's 7 kills were confirmed by multiple sources: ship observers with binoculars, other pilots. Gun camera footage would have helped, but the F-4F-4 didn't carry cameras. The physical evidence was undeniable. 7 Japanese Val bombers crashed within visual range of the fleet, all within Sweat's 15-minute engagement window, matching his described attack patterns and locations. Halsey recognized extraordinary courage when he saw it. On April 10th, just 3 days after the battle, he personally recommended Sweat for the Medal of Honor, citing 7 confirmed kills in a single mission, shot down by friendly fire while defending the fleet, successfully ditched and survived. The recommendation moved up the chain of command to the Secretary of the Navy, requiring presidential approval. President Roosevelt signed the authorization on September 24, 1943. Sweat received the medal from Halsey on October 10th at a ceremony on Espiritu Santo. War correspondents flocked to the ceremony. Sweat's story embodied everything the American public wanted to hear in 1943. A young Marine pilot, first combat mission, 7 enemy aircraft destroyed, surviving impossible odds. His story appeared in newspapers nationwide. Life magazine ran a feature with photographs. Sweat became a symbol of American fighting spirit. Naval aviators coined the phrase, "to do a Jimmy Sweat," to describe achieving legendary status in a single mission, the ultimate goal for every trainee pilot. Sweat didn't rest on his laurels. He returned to VMF 221, flying from Henderson Field and later other bases as the war moved north. By August 1943, he'd accumulated 15.5 confirmed kills, the half kill from sharing credit with another pilot on a jointly attacked bomber. He was shot down 2 more times, once over La Vela in the Solomon Islands and again over Rabaul. Both times he survived. The second shoot-down left him stranded in the jungle for 3 days before friendly natives found him and paddled him back to Allied lines in a dugout canoe. In late 1943, Sweat rotated back to the U.S. for instructor duty at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in Florida. He taught new fighter pilots everything he'd learned: attack from above and behind when possible, use short bursts to conserve ammunition, never chase a damaged enemy to the water, it makes you vulnerable, watch for friendly fire near ships, always track fuel in nearest airfields, and, most importantly, stay calm. Panic kills more pilots than enemy fire. After World War II ended in August 1945, Sweat remained in the Marine Corps Reserve. He flew F-4U Corsairs during the Korean War, though he saw no combat, and retired as a colonel in 1970, logging over 5,000 flight hours in military aircraft. He settled in Northern California, rarely speaking about his Medal of Honor or the April 7th mission. When asked, he'd simply say he'd been lucky, right place, right time, good training, nothing more. James Sweat died on January 15, 2009, at the age of 88. He was buried with full military honors at Quantico National Cemetery in Virginia, attended by hundreds of Marines, naval aviators, family members, and pilots he'd trained or who'd studied his tactics. His Medal of Honor citation was read aloud, detailing his April 7, 1943 actions and concluding with extraordinary heroism in disregard for his own safety, a phrase that defined his entire career. The April 7th raid on Tulagi was the last major Japanese air offensive in the Solomon Islands campaign. The Japanese lost 42 aircraft that day. American losses were 7 fighters. Sweat personally accounted for 1/6 of all Japanese losses. His performance influenced tactical doctrine for the rest of the war. Flight instructors used his engagement as a case study in effective fighter tactics. Attack decisively, conserve ammunition, maintain situational awareness, accept calculated risks, but avoid recklessness. These principles became standard training for all Marine fighter pilots. Beyond tactics, Sweat's mission proved that proper training could overcome inexperience. With just 197 flight hours and no combat experience, he performed flawlessly under extreme pressure. This realization transformed Navy and Marine Corps fighter pilot training, emphasizing more gunnery practice, tactical decision-making under stress, and realistic combat scenarios. Today, Sweat's F-4F Wildcat rests at the bottom of Tulagi Harbor, but his legacy endures. The Marine Corps University at Quantico includes his April 7th mission in its Air Combat Tactics curriculum. The National Museum of the Marine Corps displays his Medal of Honor and flight gear. Aviation historians regard his 7 kills in 15 minutes as one of the most remarkable achievements in aerial combat history, not just for the numbers, but for the circumstances. First mission, overwhelming odds, friendly fire damage, near-death experience, survival against all probability. Sweat's story answers a fundamental question about combat. Can training overcome inexperience? Can preparation replace proven ability? His April 7th mission proved the answer is yes. With proper training, even a rookie pilot can achieve extraordinary results. It wasn't luck. Sweat made dozens of correct tactical decisions in 15 minutes. Attack angles, target selection, ammunition conservation, escape maneuvers, ditching procedure, each reflecting his training and ability to perform under maximum stress. The phrase, "to do a Jimmy Sweat," faded from common usage as World War II veterans aged, but within the Marine Corps aviation community, it lives on. New pilots still learn about First Lieutenant James Sweat and his 7 kills on April 7, 1943. His calm under fire, tactical precision, survival instincts, refusal to give up even when his aircraft burned and sank. These qualities define not just one mission, but a career spanning 3 wars and 5 decades. 7 bombers fell from the sky above Tulagi in 15 minutes. A 22-year-old Marine pilot on his first combat mission put them there. This isn't just a story about one day in 1943. It's a story about what humans can achieve when training, courage, and determination align perfectly. James Sweat proved that on April 7, 1943, and his legacy continues to inspire every Marine pilot who climbs into a fighter cockpit today. If this story moved you, please hit the like button. It truly helps us bring more of these forgotten stories to light. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another tale of extraordinary courage from World War II. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and whether your family has any military history to share. We're honored to have you as part of this community that keeps the memory of heroes like James Sweat alive. Thank you for spending these 30 minutes with us. And until the next story, remember the brave.